So the question we want to answer this week as we enter into week 2 is, what exactly do we mean when we talk about culture? Culture is obviously a massive element of Mischel anthropology because we all have a culture and many of those cultures vary. So how do we understand that? What do we even understand by the term is important for us? So it's important for us to define what do we mean by culture. If we look at the dictionary, it really talks about different elements of culture. It is a quality in a person or a society. When people talk about being cultured, there's that element to it. There is, of course, a civilizing aspect to it, the behaviors and beliefs characteristic of a particular social ethnic group. So there's various meanings to it. And that's the first thing we need to realize, is when we talk about culture, culture has multiple yet related meanings. Multiple and related meanings. So we need to understand what we mean by it. We can think of culturing microbes in the Petri dish, for example. We'll talk about culture as being rooted in a place. That's one of the images that Native Americans use. They talk about culture as being your roots, and we talk about that as well. So one of the definitions that I find as being perhaps the most helpful is Eugene Nagel's definition, where he talks about the ideational elements of somebody's life, the aspects of your social life, your language, your religion, the ceremonies, the myth, the substance of a people. Now, you can create your own definition. In fact, if you read enough books on culture, you'll realize that everybody has their own definition. But I like Nagel's definition. Except perhaps, when we talk about, the nationality or the substance of a people, it makes it sound as though that is self-evident. In other words, you can look at that from the outside and you'll immediately know what those substances of a people are, just by observing, just by seeing how they're different to your own. And that's not always the case, right? It's not always as self-evident as we think it is. Think, for example, in your environment right now. What is the Summit University culture? What is the culture of the dormitories like? Are they all the same? Do the men's dormitories have a different culture than the female dormitories? Do the students have a different culture than the staff and the faculty? All of those elements are there. And so it's very hard sometimes just to define and say, well, this is this culture, this is this culture. And so we need to be cautious when we start trying to define people, and we'll hopefully do a good job of that as we go through this class. For example, here's one of the greatest ones. When people often ask me about my culture, I ask them about theirs. And I say, well, what is an American culture? What does an American, for example, look like? What do they believe? How do they behave? Is that an easy question to answer? It's becoming increasingly difficult to answer, in fact. There is a changing face of America. It's very hard for us to say, what does a U.S. American look like? Because the culture has changed and the racial demographic has changed. 1 in 6 people in the U.S. are of Hispanic origin today. 1 in 2 kids under 5 are children of color, as they say. And so it's very, very different. And because of the demographics of the country are changing so dramatically, it also presents us with some very good opportunities. In the generations of today, you meet and talk to more people in 1 year than most people did in their entire lifetime, a century ago. A survey done recently showed that 50 years ago, only 3 out of every 10 people in the US said that they knew somebody who was from another country. Today, that figure is 7 out of 10. And so, increasingly, more and more people know people from different countries, and that is a good thing, depending on how we evaluate those experiences. Because culture also very much is a relational exercise. Culture is relational. It's the very fact that we talk about things like a BBC culture or a Harvard University culture or a pop culture or whatever it might be, it exists in relation to other cultures, right? We understand what a Harvard culture is because we know it's different to a BBC or summer university culture. So those things are important for us to recognize that a culture exists in relation to other cultures, and that allows us to uncover sites of power. In other words, asymmetrical relations involving dominance and subordination and things like that. And to that end, it's important for us to be aware of what we call ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the inherent belief, in the superiority of one's own cultural group. A tendency to view groups or cultures from the perspective of one's own. We do that very, very easily and very subtly, but we do it nonetheless. One of the pictures that you've seen already that I like to use to illustrate that to US audiences anyway is this somewhat funny, tongue-in-cheek, yet perhaps a little bit serious picture. Now, what do you think of when you see this picture? What does it illustrate to you? How might it illustrate the idea of ethnocentrism? Well, I'll leave you to think about that and maybe talk to each other a little bit about that. But the idea here is that we don't want to view the world ethnocentrically, surely, especially as cross-cultural, intercultural workers. We don't want to view everybody else from the outside or from the perspective of my own superiority. These people do this, these people do that, Now, in a sense, we are all ethnocentric because we all have our own personal likes and dislikes. And those are the things that we feel are normal behaviors. We think they're normal behaviors because we're doing them. If they weren't normal behaviors, we wouldn't be doing them, right? And it's not only true in countries and cultures, it's also true in business. People who join new companies, for example, might say things like, I didn't know that we did things like that here. Or churches, we're used to doing things this way. So it speaks of a corporate culture even that is sometimes there. And we have a tendency to think that what we do and how we do it is the right way. And when we're confronted with other ways, we automatically tend to think that those ways must be wrong in some way. Because surely, the alternative is that I'm wrong. And we don't usually like to admit that. So we need to move beyond what Paul Hibbert calls this tourist outside view, where we look at another culture from the outside and we become critical of that culture because we don't understand it. If you go to India, you might view the habit of people in India eating with their fingers as being dirty. I can eat food with my fingers, don't know where your hands have been or whatever. Even though in the West, people eat certain things. In fact, we call them finger food. So we have decided that some things are appropriate to eat with our fingers, other things are not. But how does the Indian person view this? The Indian person views this as, well, my hands are clean and they're washed. Nobody else has eaten with my hands except me. But how many people have eaten from that knife and fork that you're picking up and about to use? So it's just a difference of perspective. How do we move beyond this tendency, however? And Hibbert suggests that one of the ways that we move beyond that is we become an insider. And being an insider doesn't mean that we accept everything about that culture wholesale without thinking about it. It does mean that we understand the culture well enough to know the things that we can critique and the things that are just simply different. It is the ability to try to see the world from somebody else's perspective. It's to empathize, to walk in someone else's shoes. Many mistakes could have been avoided on the mission field, I believe, if people recognized that just because people have a different perspective, it doesn't make them wrong, it doesn't make them ignorant. I remember speaking to a missionary once who stated that he needed to be in my country to plant churches because the locals had no idea how to plant churches, even though there was a denomination about 20 miles from his location that had started dozens of churches using only local leaders. And so his ignorance of the culture led to him having some very ethnocentric points of view, which could have been avoided had he only decided to learn some of the important aspects of that. So that leads us to the idea that, culture is caught and taught. In other words, it's one of those things that we all understand our culture. No one sat down and talked us through it and said, well, this is how you do things, this is how you don't do things. It's something that we just catch, we know. But there's other aspects to our culture, which we would say, okay, this is something that I do need to learn how to understand. A child will learn that the fire is hot and painful, but the lesson is not provided by the child's culture if the learning comes from touching the stove flame and being burned, right? So there is an intentional transmission of culture as well. And sometimes people go against their own culture intentionally because they realize that some of the aspects of their culture can be actually dangerous. And because culture is caught and taught, that's one of the reasons why it's hard to learn a new culture, to adjust to a new culture. So for those of you who are thinking, I might spend significant years of my life overseas, realize that it's very hard to adjust to a new culture. It takes a very, very long time. Not as long, hopefully, as it took you to adjust to your own culture, in all those growing up years. But it will take a significant amount of time. It's not going to happen in 6 months or 2 years, or especially not in a couple of weeks. So that's very important for us to realize. And one of the things I want to end off this lesson with, there's a lot more we could say, and you're going to pick up a lot of it hopefully from the reading. I've given you a couple of readings that I think would challenge you, would give you some ideas of what other perspectives on this topic might be. So I hope that you would read through them thoughtfully and carefully and reflect on them well in your reflections that we'll be doing. But to consider this idea of the gospel as being a supra, that is above cultural identity. Can we say that the Bible or the gospel is supra-cultural? It's above culture. Or is it embodied within a culture? Some of the readings you'll do for this course will talk about that a little bit, but I want you to think about that. Maybe talk about that with some people who you think might be interested, and say, well, the gospel itself, the gospel message might be supracultural, but even the way it is written in the Bible, it was written to a specific culture, it was written to a specific people, right? So it was not written to a vacuum. So how much of what we read is cultural, how much of it is the all peoples, all times, all places manifesto, because that is the thing, surely, that we want to communicate to people of other cultures. We certainly don't want to embed our own understandings, our own culture in that. And we'll do some work during this week to help you a little bit with that. So think about that, and there's some things that perhaps you could do even to test yourself, to say how much of what I read in the Bible is a result of my own cultural preferences. I just don't see certain things, or I assume certain things, and how much of it is actually the reality of the gospel. So you could actually pause this if you want to in the video and take some time to look through it. But I encourage you to look through this list of 38 things and determine for yourself which things would you say these are essential items. In other words, if I'm around a group of people, or I'm in a church setting and people don't do these things, then I'm not sure we can call them Christians. It's that important. But what items would we say, it doesn't really matter one way or another? And what items would you say, no, this really isn't a biblical issue at all. It's a cultural issue. And what's interesting often about this is when people go through this exercise, Christians who come from very similar backgrounds very often will actually differ on which ones that say is essential, non-essential, and in the middle. So do this test for yourself. Take some time to think through it. And maybe talk to each other a little bit about that, and we'll discuss it a little bit as well.